It was the year 1850, a time when the world was both evolving and trapped in the past. Steam engines powered trains, cities were beginning to bustle with the hum of modernity, but outside the flickering gaslights, the countryside remained untouched by progress. It was in this age of contrasts that people's deepest fears were most vividly etched into their lives. The shadows of the unknown seemed to stretch further than ever before, and with the turn of every new decade, the stories of things best left unspoken began to take shape. In a small, isolated village nestled among rolling hills in the heart of England, there was a manor that was the subject of whispered stories. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade, but every night without fail, the villagers swore they saw the lights flicker through its cracked windows. No one dared approach it, for the stories surrounding the old Westbrook Manor were far too chilling to ignore. Young Thomas Harper had always been skeptical of such superstitions. He grew up hearing tales from his grandmother, stories about the ghosts of lost souls, the shrill cries of people long dead, and the strange creatures that haunted the forests. However, he dismissed them all as fancies of an overactive imagination. But when Thomas's father fell ill with a mysterious sickness that had already claimed the lives of several others in the village, Thomas found himself drawn to the manor. He couldn't explain why. It was as though something invisible was pulling him toward it, a force he couldn't resist. One evening, under the cover of a pale moon, Thomas ventured into the heart of the woods, towards the ominous silhouette of Westbrook Manor. The cold air nipped at his skin, and the distant howls of wolves echoed through the trees. But Thomas was not deterred. He had heard the villagers' warnings, but he was determined to uncover the truth. As he neared the manor, he noticed the odd sense of stillness that surrounded it. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. The tall iron gates creaked as he pushed them open, and the gravel path crunched underfoot. The house itself stood tall and foreboding, its stone walls covered in vines, windows dark and lifeless. Yet, as Thomas approached the front door, he could swear he saw a faint flicker of light from within. Pushing aside the lingering doubts in his mind, he entered. The door swung open with an eerie groan, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty halls. The interior was just as desolate as the exterior, covered in dust and decay. Furniture lay abandoned, rotting away with time, and the air was thick with the musty smell of mildew. Yet, there was something else, an oppressive silence that seemed to settle over him like a weight. He moved cautiously through the manor, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. But it wasn't until he reached the grand staircase that he felt it, an unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, a fleeting movement in the corner of his eye, a whisper he couldn't quite hear. But then, the air grew colder. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his breath became shallow. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of something moving upstairs. Frozen in place, Thomas's heart raced. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was moving just out of sight. He turned on his heel and made his way cautiously toward the staircase. Each step he took seemed to echo louder than the last, and with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Thomas reached the top of the stairs, his pulse quickening with each breath. At the far end of the hall, he could see a faint light coming from beneath a door. It was a small sliver, enough to make the shadows in the hallway seem even darker. Without thinking, Thomas approached the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, he heard a voice, a whisper, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind. "Turn back." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it was clear. Thomas hesitated, his mind racing. He had to know what was going on in this house. His father's illness was strange, and the villagers had spoken of unnatural occurrences, illnesses that couldn't be explained, disappearances, and eerie happenings that were tied to the very grounds he now stood on. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was bathed in a soft, flickering light. But what caught Thomas's attention was not the light itself, but the figure sitting in the center of the room. It was a woman, her back to him, her long black hair cascading down her back. She wore a tattered dress, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman slowly turned to face him, and Thomas recoiled in horror. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and the skin of her face was pale, stretched tightly over her bones. But it was her smile, a grotesque, unnatural smile, that sent a chill down his spine. Her teeth were sharp, elongated, and her lips stretched too far, too wide. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice a low rasp that seemed to echo in the walls around him. Before Thomas could react, the room seemed to warp, the shadows around him growing longer and darker, twisting like serpents in the dim light. The woman's smile widened further, and Thomas could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient and malicious closing in around him. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the room fell silent again. The woman vanished, and the shadows receded. Thomas stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The house seemed to have returned to its normal state, but something had changed. He could feel it in the air, a dark presence that lingered just beyond the veil of his perception. As he left the manor, the whispers began again, growing louder and more frantic. And with each step he took away from Westbrook Manor, he felt the pull of something far more terrifying than any of the villagers' stories. The shadows were not gone. They had only begun to move. The cold night air outside seemed to have no effect on the chill that had settled deep within Thomas's bones. As he walked back towards the village, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The events inside the manor had unfolded with such surreal intensity that he couldn't quite comprehend what had happened. Had it been a dream? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The flickering lights from the manor still haunted him, dancing behind his eyelids every time he closed his eyes. He couldn't shake the image of the woman with her sharp, gaping smile, the way her eyes never blinked, as if they could see into his very soul. The words she had whispered to him echoed in his mind. "I've been waiting for you." But who could she have been? And why had she singled him out? His heart raced with every step as he crossed the last stretch of the village's main road. By the time he reached his house, the first light of dawn had begun to appear on the horizon, but the terror from the manor still gripped him. He hadn't spoken a word to anyone about what he had seen. Who would believe him? They would say it was a trick of the mind, a product of his overactive imagination, or worse, that it was something unnatural, beyond human comprehension. When Thomas entered his house, he found his father lying in the same position he had been in earlier that morning. His pale face was sweating with fever, his body trembling as though he were caught in the grip of something far more dreadful than any sickness Thomas had seen before. He rushed to his side, placing a cool cloth on his father's forehead, but the terror of what had transpired at Westbrook Manor kept creeping back, like a shadow that refused to fade. He had to go back, didn't he? There was something in that house, something that held the answers to the village's cursed fate. Over the next few days, Thomas tried to bury the fear that gnawed at his insides. He helped care for his father, who seemed to grow weaker with each passing day. The villagers continued to murmur about the manor, and the stories of people who had disappeared, and those who had fallen ill after stepping foot on its cursed grounds. Thomas could sense that the village was slowly becoming consumed by an air of dread and suspicion. His once carefree home was now steeped in the same darkness he had felt inside the manor. There were rumors of strange, unexplainable deaths. Some said it was the curse of the manor, others believed it was the wrath of vengeful spirits. One evening, desperate for answers, Thomas confided in old Mary, the village healer. She was known for her knowledge of herbs, potions, and the darker arts. Most of the villagers feared her, yet Thomas had always found solace in her presence when he was young. Her cottage was tucked away at the edge of the village, surrounded by thickets of trees, far from the prying eyes of those who didn't understand her craft. "I've seen the shadows at Westbrook," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're real. I saw them, or perhaps I saw something worse." Old Mary didn't say anything for a long time. She simply stared at him with a knowing look, her deep-set eyes twinkling with secrets long buried. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows on her wrinkled face, making her look like she was part of the very darkness that haunted the manor. "You've been marked," she said softly, her voice like the wind whispering through the trees. "The curse of Westbrook is not just a story, it is a truth, one that has claimed the lives of many who've dared to cross its threshold." Thomas swallowed hard. "A curse," he repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "But why me?" "The manor has stood for centuries, boy. A place of evil, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead are thinner than most can bear. It is no ordinary house. There is something ancient, something that feeds on the souls of the living. When the woman you saw called out to you, she was not just waiting for anyone. She knew your bloodline, your connection to the land." Thomas recoiled. "What are you saying?" "My family, we've lived here for generations." "What does it have to do with the manor?" Old Mary's eyes narrowed as she leaned closer. "Your ancestor, Thomas Harper, was one of the first to build the manor. He made a pact with a dark force, an entity from beyond, and in exchange for wealth and power, he bound the souls of his heirs to the land. That is the price of their fortune." Thomas recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. "No, that can't be true. My father, he would never." "The truth is never easy to swallow," old Mary interrupted. "Your father may not know, but the darkness is tied to him, to your family. The woman you saw, she's a spirit bound to the manor, a victim of the curse. But there are others, many others, who have been drawn into its web." As the old woman spoke, the weight of her words pressed down on Thomas like a storm cloud gathering overhead. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of the revelation. He had come to the manor searching for answers, but now it seemed as though the very roots of his existence were entangled with something far more terrifying than he could have imagined. "I have to go back," he whispered, his voice shaking with determination. "I need to break the curse. I need to save my father." Old Mary's gaze softened. "You cannot fight what you do not understand. The curse will not be lifted by force. It must be appeased, or you will only make it stronger. But Thomas didn't listen. He left her cottage in a daze, the weight of his newfound knowledge pressing down on him like an iron chain. He had to return to Westbrook Manor. He had to find a way to undo what his ancestor had done. As he walked back to the manor, the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful wail that seemed to echo the horrors that had unfolded inside. But this time, as he crossed the gates of the manor once again, he wasn't just a curious young man seeking answers. He was a man determined to break a curse, even if it meant facing the very thing that had haunted his family for centuries. The door of Westbrook Manor creaked open as if it had been waiting for him all along.